I inherited a rundown farm from my late wife, while my son received a $9 million penthouse in San Francisco. My own son called me a useless old man and threw me out into the pouring rain with nothing but 2 black trash bags. So I decided to drive north and spend the night at that abandoned farm. But when I pushed open the rusted barn doors, I completely froze at what I saw inside. I am Calvin, 64 years old, and before I continue this story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the San Francisco penthouse, blurring the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge into streaks of neon gold. I sat on the edge of the Italian leather sofa, my rough hands resting on my knees. Across from me sat Sullivan, the ruthless corporate attorney my late wife Beatrice had kept on retainer for decades. He was meticulously straightening a stack of legal documents. My son Cameron and his wife Vanessa sat adjacent to me. Vanessa was dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the part of the grieving daughter-in-law to perfection. Beatrice had only been gone for 2 weeks. 35 years of marriage extinguished by a sudden heart failure, leaving a silence in my life so deafening I could barely hear the storm outside. Sullivan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. He read the final stipulations of the will with a cold, mechanical precision. To my son Cameron, I leave the deed to the penthouse located in downtown San Francisco in its entirety. To my husband Calvin, I leave the deed to the old Sonoma farm property. The remaining liquid assets have been distributed to various charities as previously outlined. Sullivan closed the leather-bound folder. The finality of the clasp snapping shut echoed in the cavernous living room. I stared at the glass coffee table. Beatrice was a brilliant woman, a retired accountant who managed every penny we ever earned. We had lived in this penthouse for 5 years, but the Sonoma farm was a property she had purchased 2 decades ago. She had always managed it strictly by herself, forbidding anyone, even me, from going up there. She claimed it was a tax right off a piece of barren land with a dilapidated barn. To leave me nothing but an overgrown patch of weeds after 35 years made no logical sense. But as a retired structural engineer, I knew better than to question the foundation before inspecting the beams. Beatrice always had a blueprint. Always. Sullivan stood up, shook Cameron by the hand, offered me a stiff nod, and walked out of the apartment. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The very second the lock engaged, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. Vanessa dropped the silk handkerchief onto the table. Her posture straightened, the fake sorrow vanishing from her face like a theater curtain dropping. She looked around the massive living room, her eyes gleaming with undisguised greed. She walked over to the custom wine fridge, pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne, and began untwisting the wire cage. Cameron did not look at me. He walked straight into the kitchen, pulled open a drawer, and returned holding 2 heavy-duty black trash bags. He walked over to where I was sitting and dropped them directly onto my scuffed work boots. "Pack your things, old man. Vanessa wants the master suite cleared by midnight." I looked up at my son. A boy I had taught to ride a bike, a boy whose college tuition I had paid by working double shifts on construction sites. Now he was a 32-year-old tech startup founder wearing a $4,000 suit, looking down at me with absolute disgust. I kept my voice calm and steady. "Cameron, it is pouring rain outside. It is 10 o'clock at night." He sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "And whose problem is that?" "Mom finally realized what a deadbeat you are. She knew you were just coasting on her success. That is why she left you the dirt and left me the empire. You have 2 hours to get your junk out of my house. If you are not gone by midnight, I am calling building security to have you escorted out for trespassing." Vanessa walked over, handing Cameron a crystal flute of champagne. She took a sip and smiled at me. "Do not make a scene, Calvin. It is embarrassing. Just take your trash bags and go. We have interior decorators coming tomorrow morning at 8, and we cannot have your dusty old tools cluttering up the foyer." A lesser man would have yelled. A weaker man would have begged for a few days to find a cheap apartment. But I did not survive 40 years building steel frameworks hundreds of feet in the air by losing my temper. Anger is a useless emotion. It clouds judgment. I looked at Cameron, truly seeing him for the first time. The entitlement, the arrogance, the absolute lack of respect. He had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. I did not say a single word. I stood up, took the 2 black bags, and walked down the hall to the master bedroom. I did not pack the expensive watches Beatrice had gifted me over the years. I did not take the tailored suits. I packed my worn-out work boots, my trusted engineering calipers, a few changes of practical clothes, and the favorite cashmere scarf Beatrice used to wear during the winter. That was all I needed. I walked back through the living room 15 minutes later. Cameron and Vanessa were already sitting on the sofa laughing and looking at fabric swatches on a tablet. They did not even look up as I opened the front door and walked out of the only home I had known for the last 5 years. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was perfectly silent. I threw the bags into the passenger seat of my beat-up Ford truck, turned the ignition, and drove out into the stormy San Francisco night. The rain was coming down in sheets, aggressively pounding against the windshield as I merged onto the highway heading north toward Sonoma. The drive took nearly 2 hours in the treacherous weather. My mind raced with questions, analyzing the data points of my current reality. Why the farm? Why did Beatrice leave me a ruined piece of agricultural land? She was not a cruel woman. She was calculated. Every decision she made had a purpose. As the city lights faded behind me and the dark, winding country roads of Sonoma took over, a strange sense of anticipation began to replace the sting of my son's betrayal. I turned onto a gravel road completely swallowed by overgrown oak trees. My headlights cut through the heavy downpour, finally illuminating a rusted 10-foot-tall iron gate. I stepped out into the freezing rain, retrieving a heavy iron key Beatrice had kept in a locked drawer. I forced it into the ancient padlock. It took immense effort, but the lock finally gave way. I pushed the heavy gates open and drove the truck down the muddy path. The farm was completely isolated. At the end of the path stood the barn. It looked exactly as I had imagined from the outside. Weathered wooden planks, a sagging roofline, and an aura of total abandonment. I parked the truck, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the glove compartment, and walked toward the massive wooden sliding doors. I expected to find a collapsed roof, decades of rotting hay, and if I was lucky, a dry corner to set up a camping cot for the night. I grabbed the rusted iron handle. I braced my legs and pulled with all my remaining strength. The heavy door groaned, sliding back on its tracks. I stepped inside, raising my flashlight. But before I could even click the button, the environment reacted to my presence. The lights did not flicker on like old fluorescent tubes. They activated in a rapid sequential wave via high-tech motion sensors, flooding the massive space with brilliant clinical white light. I completely froze, the breath catching in my throat. There were no tractors. There was no hay. The interior of the dilapidated barn had been completely gutted and retrofitted. I was standing inside a massive temperature-controlled, hermetically sealed room. The air was cool and crisp, vibrating with a low, continuous hum. Stretching out before me were rows upon rows of massive black monoliths. They were state-of-the-art server racks, blinking with thousands of green and blue lights, processing unimaginable amounts of data. This was not a farm. It was a dark fiber data center. And right in the middle of the room, a sleek biometric terminal lit up, waiting for a command. The storm outside was completely unrelenting as I stood before the massive wooden sliding doors of the barn. The freezing rain soaked completely through my heavy canvas coat and chilled me straight down to the bone. My boots sank deep into the thick mud that surrounded the entrance. I gripped the heavy iron handle with both hands. My knuckles turned entirely white from the sheer cold and the extreme physical exertion. The rusted iron tracks groaned in loud protest as I threw all my body weight backward. For a terrifying moment, I thought the ancient mechanism was completely rusted shut and I would be forced to sleep in my truck. But then, with a deafening screech that cut right through the chaotic sound of the pouring rain, the heavy wooden door finally yielded. It slid back just enough for a grown man to step through the narrow gap. I wiped the freezing water from my face, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the violent storm. I was entirely enveloped by the absolute darkness of the barn interior. I reached deeply into my coat pocket to pull out my heavy-duty flashlight. I fully expected the overwhelming smell of rotting wood, decades of damp hay, and animal decay. I expected the hollow echo of a ruined wooden structure waiting to eventually collapse under the weight of the storm. But the air that hit my face was completely different. It was entirely dry, perfectly filtered, and distinctly chilled to an exact regulated temperature. Before my freezing thumb could even press the rubber button on my flashlight, the entire environment reacted to my physical presence. There was no hesitation whatsoever. There was absolutely no flickering of old fluorescent bulbs struggling to find power in the middle of nowhere. A brilliant, intense wave of clinical white light completely flooded the massive space in a fraction of a second. The bright illumination cascaded perfectly from the high ceiling, triggering row by row in a rapid, highly calculated sequence guided by high-end motion sensors. I simply froze completely in my tracks. The heavy flashlight slipped right out of my numb fingers and hit the solid floor with a loud, dense thud. It did not hit packed dirt or rotting wooden floorboards. It struck a pristine layer of reinforced epoxy resin that had been poured perfectly level over a massive solid concrete foundation. As a retired structural engineer, I immediately recognized the immense financial cost and the extreme physical precision required to pour such a perfect industrial floor. I slowly raised my head to take in the sheer impossible scale of the space. There were absolutely no tractors anywhere in sight. There were no rusted plows, no old farming tools, and no bales of hay. The exterior weathered wooden walls of the barn were nothing but an extremely clever architectural facade designed to fool anyone driving past the property. Directly behind the fake weathered wooden exterior was a hermetically sealed state-of-the-art industrial enclosure. The interior walls were heavily lined with thick thermal insulation and reinforced ballistic steel panels. But what completely stole the breath directly from my lungs were the massive structures dominating the center of the giant room. Stretching out before me in perfect symmetrical alignment were dozens upon dozens of towering black monoliths. They were massive commercial-grade enterprise server racks. Thousands upon thousands of tiny green and blue LED lights blinked in a frantic rhythmic synchronization across the dark glass panels. A low continuous mechanical hum vibrated strongly through the thick soles of my boots. It was the sound of massive industrial cooling fans working tirelessly to keep the processor core temperatures down to optimal levels. Thick bundles of heavy-duty fiber optic cables cascaded from the ceiling like mechanical vines, feeding directly into the top of each black tower. The sheer amount of raw electrical power surging through this single room was absolutely staggering. I walked very slowly down the wide central aisle between the humming monoliths. My analytical mind struggled desperately to process the immense magnitude of what my eyes were seeing. This was not a farm. It was a completely private, incredibly lucrative dark fiber data center. I ran my rough hand along the cold metal side panel of one of the server racks. A sudden wave of profound realization crashed completely over me. Beatrice was never just a simple corporate accountant. I remembered all those long nights she stayed awake until 4 a.m. in our apartment. She always claimed she was just balancing complex ledgers for boring corporate clients. I remembered how she absolutely insisted on managing our personal internet security. She had told me the farm was just a barren tax write-off, but the brilliant woman I had been married to for 35 years was operating on a level I had never even begun to comprehend. She was the silent, totally invisible infrastructure landlord for half of the Silicon Valley tech industry. At the very end of the long central aisle sat a sleek, minimalist desk made completely of brushed aluminum. On top of the desk rested a single, wide, curved monitor and a heavy glass biometric scanning pad. I approached the terminal with incredibly slow, highly hesitant steps. The exact moment I stood directly in front of the desk, a hidden camera embedded in the top bezel of the monitor glowed with a faint red ring. The screen remained entirely black for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a soft electronic chime echoed through the silent, chilled air of the massive server room. The screen instantly flashed to vibrant life. A crisp, mechanical voice echoed from hidden speakers, stating that facial recognition was completely verified and system authorization was fully granted to the primary user. I had never registered my face for this incredibly advanced system. Beatrice had done it for me entirely in secret. She had anticipated this exact moment down to the very second. She knew Cameron would eventually force me out into the cold. The diagnostic text on the screen vanished instantly, replaced entirely by a pre-recorded high-definition video file. I stared at the crystal-clear image. Beatrice was sitting right there on the screen, looking exactly as she had 6 months before her heart failed. She was wearing her favorite blue cashmere sweater, her silver hair perfectly styled. She looked directly into the camera lens with a calm, extremely calculating expression. A heavy lump formed deep in my throat as her familiar voice filled the massive humming room. "Hello, Calvin?" She began, her tone gentle, but carrying an unmistakable weight of absolute authority. If you are watching this video right now, it means my absolute worst fears have unfortunately come to pass. It means our son Cameron has proven himself to be exactly the arrogant, selfish, and incredibly greedy man I always suspected he was hiding beneath his expensive, tailored suits. I know he threw you out into the rain tonight. I know he gave you those black garbage bags and humiliated you in front of his terrible wife, Vanessa. I also know you did not raise your voice because you have always possessed a quiet, unshakable dignity that our son completely lacks. I leaned much closer to the glowing screen, my hands gripping the cold edge of the aluminum desk. Beatrice paused in the video, taking a slow, deliberate sip of tea before continuing her final message. "You are probably wondering why I left you an abandoned piece of dirt while I gave Cameron the $9 million luxury penthouse. You probably think I lost my mind in my final days. But you know I never leave anything to chance, Calvin. I built this data center out of absolutely nothing. I own the digital roads that Cameron and his little tech startup rely on to survive. But more importantly, I need you to open the top drawer of the desk you are standing in front of right now. Inside, you will find the master incorporation documents for a company called Ironclad Holdings." I immediately reached down and pulled open the heavy metal drawer. A thick, leather-bound folder rested inside. Beatrice continued speaking from the screen, her voice turning remarkably cold and utterly ruthless. "I did leave Cameron the deed to the San Francisco penthouse. But what my lawyer Sullivan intentionally failed to mention tonight is that Ironclad Holdings owns the farm. Ironclad Holdings owns all of these servers. And Ironclad Holdings is the sole proprietor of a fully callable $9 million mortgage on that exact same penthouse. I did not give him an empire, Calvin. I gave him an illusion. I left the farm to you because the farm actually owns the penthouse. And as the sole owner of Ironclad Holdings, you now have the absolute legal power to crush him whenever you are ready." I placed my hands on the cold, brushed aluminum desk. The pre-recorded high-definition video of my late wife faded into absolute blackness. A new screen emerged from the shadows of the monitor. It was a highly secure operating system interface. I reached for the wireless mouse and slowly navigated toward a heavily encrypted folder located directly in the center of the desktop. The folder was labeled Ironclad Holdings Master Ledger. The system did not prompt me for a complex password or a security token. Beatrice had already authorized my unique biometric profile for full administrative access long before her death. I clicked the folder, and dozens of highly detailed legal documents instantly flooded the wide, curved monitor. I opened the primary corporate incorporation file first. Beatrice had established Ironclad Holdings exactly 10 years ago as a completely anonymous limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. As I scrolled carefully down through the massive asset columns, my breath caught sharply in my throat. I am a retired structural engineer. I have spent my entire professional life analyzing load-bearing walls and calculating extreme foundational stress points. What Beatrice had built here was an impenetrable financial fortress. Ironclad Holdings owned the massive 50-acre plot of land we were currently standing on. It owned every single multi-million-dollar enterprise server rack humming quietly in this room. But the single document that made my blood run completely cold was a separate digital file labeled San Francisco Property Lien. I opened it and began to read the dense legal text. When Cameron bought his luxury penthouse 5 years ago, he bragged relentlessly to our entire family about his immense corporate success. He claimed his newly launched tech startup was generating massive revenue, and he boasted that he bought the luxury property entirely with cash. That was a complete and utter lie. The document glowing brightly on my screen was a private commercial loan agreement. Beatrice had quietly funneled $9 million through Ironclad Holdings to secretly finance Cameron's penthouse purchase. She literally held the mortgage. But this was not a standard 30-year residential loan. It was a fully callable commercial promissory note. That meant Ironclad Holdings had the absolute legal right to demand the entire $9 million principal balance be paid in full within a strict 72-hour notice period. Sullivan, the attorney, had told the absolute truth in the living room when he said Cameron inherited the deed. But a property deed is absolutely worthless when an anonymous corporate entity holds a massive legally binding lien against the equity. Cameron did not own an empire. He owned a fragile piece of paper. And I now owned the $9 million debt permanently attached to it. My intense thoughts were suddenly violently interrupted. My cell phone began vibrating loudly against the hard aluminum surface of the desk. The harsh buzzing sound echoed strangely through the massive, cavernous server room. I looked down at the glowing digital screen. It was Cameron. I let the phone ring 3 full times before I calmly swiped the glass to answer. I did not say hello. I just brought the device to my ear and listened quietly. I could clearly hear the loud clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the heavy thumping bass of party music in the background. My son had not even waited 24 hours after throwing me out into a freezing storm to host a lavish celebration in my former home. "So you made it to the dirt patch, old man," Cameron said. His voice was thick with extreme arrogance and perhaps a little bit of premium alcohol. "I hope you found a dry corner in that rotting wooden barn to unroll your cheap sleeping bag." I stared blankly at the thousands of blinking blue and green lights reflecting off the polished epoxy resin floor. "It is completely dry in here, Cameron," I replied, making sure my voice remained completely steady and totally devoid of any visible emotion. "Good," he snapped back quickly, "because I need you to do something vaguely useful for once in your miserable life." Vanessa and I were just talking to our private financial advisor. We are actively restructuring my tech company assets, and we desperately need a massive tax write-off for the upcoming fiscal quarter. That worthless farm you just inherited is perfectly zoned for commercial agricultural demolition. I am sending a digital quitclaim deed to your email inbox right now. I need you to sign over your inherited legal rights to the farm by tomorrow morning. We are going to bulldoze whatever pathetic shack you are standing in and claim a total property depreciation loss on our corporate taxes. The sheer terrifying audacity of his demand hung heavily in the chilled, filtered air of the data center. He had thrown me out into a freezing storm with nothing but 2 garbage bags of old work clothes. And less than an hour later, he was forcefully demanding I hand over the absolute only property I had left in the world, just so he could save a few $1,000s on his corporate tax returns. I took a very slow and deep breath. The cool air filled my lungs. "I am not signing anything, Cameron," I said quietly. The loud party music in the background suddenly muffled entirely, as if he had stormed into a private room and slammed the heavy door shut. "Excuse me," he hissed viciously through the phone speaker. "You are going to sign it, Calvin. You have absolutely zero financial leverage here. You are a broke retired construction worker with nowhere else to go. You will sign the quitclaim deed tonight, or I will personally make sure you spend your entire retirement begging for loose change on the dangerous streets of San Francisco." I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not threaten him back. I simply pulled the phone away from my face, pressed the red button on my screen, and ended the call. I placed the phone gently back down onto the desk. The peaceful silence of the server room returned, broken only by the constant low mechanical hum of the massive industrial cooling fans. Exactly 5 minutes passed in total unbroken peace. Then my phone lit up again. It was not another angry phone call. It was an automated high-priority email notification. I tapped the glass screen to open the message. The sender was the Executive Human Resources Department of Cameron's tech startup. The bold subject line read, "Immediate termination of comprehensive health benefits." When I had officially retired 5 years ago, Beatrice had cleverly arranged for my health insurance to be managed through Cameron's corporate policy, since we were secretly paying his early startup operational costs. Now the cold corporate email plainly stated that as of midnight, my comprehensive medical coverage was permanently canceled due to a sudden executive directive from the chief executive officer. I stared at the harsh black text glowing on the bright white screen. A sudden sharp tightness gripped the direct center of my chest. It was not a physical heart attack. It was the crushing emotional manifestation of absolute familial betrayal. I am 64 years old. Cameron knew perfectly well that I relied heavily on that specific premium insurance policy to afford my daily preventative cardiovascular medication. By illegally canceling my health insurance out of pure vindictive spite, he was not just trying to make me financially destitute. He was actively and entirely willing to gamble with my physical health and my actual life just to punish me for saying the word no. The heavy tightness in my chest slowly dissolved into a profound and glacial emotional coldness. Absolutely all paternal instincts I had left for the arrogant boy I had raised completely evaporated into the chilled air of the server room. He wanted to play a ruthless corporate game. He wanted to use his tech startup as a blunt weapon to destroy my life. I slowly lifted my head and looked deeply into the massive rows of humming black server towers stretching out into the darkness. Beatrice had clearly stated on the video that she literally owned the digital roads that Silicon Valley traveled on. I leaned forward in the ergonomic chair and placed both of my hands firmly onto the mechanical keyboard. I opened a new complex network diagnostic window on the wide monitor. I decided it was time to closely examine the specific encrypted data traffic flowing constantly through my late wife's massive servers. I quickly typed in a secure command prompt to filter the global network routing logs. I searched specifically for the unique IP addresses and the registered corporate domain names directly associated with Cameron's tech startup. The detailed results populated heavily on the screen almost instantly. Cameron's entire company digital infrastructure, from his internal corporate payroll ledgers to his highly private executive communications, was conveniently passing directly through the physical hardware sitting less than 20 feet away from where I sat. I began to pull the encrypted data packets from the active data stream, feeling absolutely no remorse as I prepared to completely dismantle the fake empire my son thought he owned. I stared at the blinking cursor on the wide, curved monitor. The massive data center around me hummed with a steady, rhythmic vibration that felt entirely out of place against the complete financial ruin I was about to uncover. Beatrice had given me the ultimate skeleton key to the digital world. By having administrative control over the physical dark fiber infrastructure, I possessed the ability to intercept and monitor the unencrypted raw data packets flowing into and out of Cameron's tech startup. I am a structural engineer by trade. I have spent my entire life looking for microscopic stress fractures in massive steel support beams. I know exactly how to find the weak points in a seemingly perfect foundation. And the foundation of my son's supposed empire was crumbling much faster than I could have ever imagined. I executed a highly secure network diagnostic protocol to isolate the traffic routing directly from his corporate headquarters. The raw data began cascading down the bright monitor in complex numerical columns. It took me less than 45 minutes of careful sorting to completely bypass his amateur corporate firewall and access the primary financial ledgers of his company. Cameron had always bragged at family dinners that his software application was revolutionizing the tech industry, and generating millions in pure profit. But the harsh reality glowing on the screen in front of me told a completely different and utterly pathetic story. The tech startup was completely bankrupt. The internal corporate accounts were bleeding massive amounts of capital every single month. I opened a folder containing desperate internal communications between Cameron and his chief financial officer. The emails were filled with absolute panic. They were actively bouncing payroll checks. They had completely stopped paying their primary software vendors over 6 months ago. The company was nothing more than a hollow shell artificially propped up by fake revenue projections and relentless corporate lies. But if the company was completely broke, I needed to understand exactly how Cameron was actively financing his lavish lifestyle. Just tonight, he was hosting a massive yacht party and buying expensive vintage champagne for his wife, Vanessa. I shifted my focus away from the corporate ledgers and began tracking his private banking transfers. The sheer scale of his reckless personal spending was absolutely sickening. I traced hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing directly into luxury car dealerships, high-end designer clothing boutiques, and extravagant international vacations designed exclusively to impress Vanessa. She demanded a life of absolute luxury, and Cameron was completely willing to destroy everything to give it to her. I leaned closer to the monitor as I noticed a massive anomaly in the financial routing history. 3 months ago, a sudden massive influx of capital had dropped directly into Cameron's private offshore account. It was a single wire transfer for exactly $4 million. I traced the routing numbers back to their absolute origin point. The money did not come from a legitimate venture capital firm or a standard commercial bank. It originated from a highly obscured shadow lending syndicate operating entirely out of the Cayman Islands. These were not regular bankers. They were incredibly dangerous private lenders who dealt strictly in high-interest bridge loans, and they demanded absolute ironclad collateral for their money. I opened the attached digital loan agreement that Cameron had signed and emailed to the offshore syndicate. As I read the heavily encrypted legal terms, a cold wave of absolute shock washed completely over me. To secure the $4 million illegal shadow loan, Cameron had pledged his brand-new San Francisco penthouse as the sole physical collateral. He had officially signed legal documents stating that he owned the $9 million property free and clear with absolutely no outstanding debts or secondary liens attached to the deed. My hands actually trembled slightly as I realized the monumental scale of the legal trap my son had just blindly stepped into. Cameron only possessed the physical deed to the penthouse. He did not own the actual equity. Ironclad Holdings owned the $9 million mortgage. By leveraging a property he did not truly own to secure a secondary massive cash loan from an international shadow syndicate, Cameron had directly committed federal bank fraud and international wire fraud. He had double-pledged the exact same asset. The mathematical equation of his impending destruction was perfectly clear in my mind. If I instructed Sullivan to legally call in the $9 million mortgage through Ironclad Holdings, Cameron would instantly lose the penthouse. But the absolute second that foreclosure went public, the offshore shadow lenders would immediately realize their $4 million collateral had completely vanished into thin air. Cameron would not just be completely broke and homeless. He would simultaneously face 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, while desperately trying to hide from highly dangerous loan sharks who wanted their $4 million back. He had built his entire arrogant life on a foundation of pure gasoline, and Beatrice had handed me the only match. I sat back in the ergonomic chair, feeling the heavy weight of the absolute power I now held. I did not feel any joy. I only felt the cold, necessary logic of a structural engineer preparing to initiate a controlled demolition. I reached for the keyboard to begin drafting an encrypted message to Sullivan to initiate the devastating foreclosure process. But before my fingers could even touch the keys, the peaceful environment of the massive server room violently shifted. A sudden sharp electronic chime echoed loudly from the biometric terminal. The financial data on the curved monitor instantly vanished. It was entirely replaced by a high-definition grid of 8 different security camera feeds, broadcasting live from the exterior perimeter of the farm. I stared intensely at the top left camera feed overlooking the rusted iron gates I had locked just an hour ago. The heavy freezing rain was still pouring down in sheets, but the infrared night vision lenses captured the threat perfectly. A massive black luxury SUV with heavily tinted windows had just pulled off the muddy county road and parked aggressively right against the metal gates. Cameron was not just content with illegally cutting off my critical medical insurance. He had realized that threatening me over the phone was simply not enough to force me to sign away the property deed. The heavy doors of the black SUV swung open. 4 large men wearing dark tactical clothing and heavy boots stepped out into the freezing mud. They did not look like local law enforcement or standard process servers. They moved with the aggressive, coordinated posture of highly paid private security contractors. They were brutal men, hired off the books to physically intimidate an old retired man and force him entirely off his own property by any violent means necessary. I watched calmly through the high-definition monitor as the largest man in the group pulled a heavy set of industrial bolt cutters from the trunk of the vehicle and began walking directly toward my locked gates. They thought they were breaking into a rotting wooden barn to easily terrify a helpless old man. They had absolutely no idea they were actively attempting to breach a highly secure federal-grade data facility. I slowly pushed my chair back from the desk and prepared to introduce them to the real security protocols of the Sonoma farm. I watched the high-definition security feed with absolute focus. The 4 large men trudged heavily up the long, muddy gravel driveway. The torrential rain was completely soaking their dark tactical gear, but they did not seem to care at all. They moved with the arrogant swagger of brutal men who were entirely used to terrifying helpless people into total submission. The largest man in the front carried a massive pair of industrial bolt cutters over his broad shoulder. He walked directly up to the fake wooden exterior of the barn. I sat comfortably in the ergonomic chair deep inside the hermetically sealed server room. I felt absolutely no fear whatsoever. I only felt a cold, analytical curiosity about how Beatrice had actually programmed the exterior defense systems. The leader raised the heavy steel bolt cutters and clamped them violently onto the rusted padlock, securing the exterior gate. He snapped the old metal with a single forceful crunch, and the heavy iron chains fell away into the freezing mud. They marched straight toward the main sliding doors. The leader raised a heavy steel crowbar and prepared to smash the wooden frame. He clearly thought he was only seconds away from dragging a terrified 64-year-old man out into the violent storm. I slowly reached out and placed my right hand perfectly flat on the glass biometric scanning pad. The system instantly recognized my unique fingerprints. A hidden tactical menu cascaded down the right side of the wide, curved monitor. Beatrice had not just built a lucrative data center. She had built an absolute digital fortress. I located the primary perimeter defense protocol. I did not issue any sort of verbal warning to the men outside. I simply pressed the glowing red activation icon on the screen. The physical response of the building was absolutely instantaneous and completely terrifying. Before the thug's crowbar could even strike the wooden door, a series of explosive pneumatic charges hissed loudly from the roofline. Massive slabs of solid reinforced ballistic steel dropped down from hidden internal compartments with a deafening metallic crash. The heavy steel shutters slammed perfectly into the reinforced concrete foundation, completely sealing the massive structure behind an impenetrable wall of heavy armor. The sheer concussive force of the steel hitting the solid concrete actually shook the mud directly beneath the attacker's boots. But the automated defense sequence was not finished. A fraction of a second later, a perimeter array of extreme high-intensity tactical LED floodlights violently erupted from the roofline. They were completely blinding. The intense white light was so incredibly bright that the exterior night vision cameras automatically adjusted their digital exposure just to compensate for the glare. Through the monitor, I watched the 4 hardened security contractors instantly drop their heavy tools and cover their faces in total absolute agony. They stumbled backward blindly into the deep, thick mud. Then a massive automated siren began to wail through commercial-grade exterior speakers. A calm, mechanical voice echoed across the flooded valley, stating clearly that the property was a secured federal data facility. The automated voice calmly announced that the county sheriff dispatcher was currently monitoring their exact physical location through a live encrypted audio and video feed, and that highly armed response units were already in transit. The thugs did not wait a single second to hear anything else. The sudden, overwhelming realization that they were absolutely not dealing with a helpless old man broke their violent courage instantly. The leader scrambled frantically through the deep mud, slipping and falling heavily onto his knees. He abandoned his expensive, heavy tools entirely. All four men sprinted blindly back toward their massive black vehicle. I watched calmly as the panicked driver slammed the heavy luxury SUV into reverse, entirely destroying a large patch of decorative bushes as he frantically spun the heavy tires. They sped off down the dark country road, disappearing completely into the violent storm. I sat alone in the perfect quiet of the humming server room. The perimeter was entirely secure. Cameron had tried raw physical violence, and he had completely failed. I spent the rest of the night familiarizing myself with the massive digital infrastructure my late wife had built. By the time the violent storm finally broke the next morning, the bright sun was shining clearly through the high reinforced glass skylights. I had located a small emergency survival cache in the back of the facility containing premium freeze-dried coffee and fresh bottled water. I was sitting calmly at the aluminum desk drinking a hot cup of coffee when the secure operating system chimed loudly with an incoming high-priority message. It was a heavily encrypted legal delivery sent directly to my private email address. The sender was a massive and notoriously aggressive corporate law firm based directly in downtown San Francisco. They were the primary legal representatives for Cameron's failing tech startup. I slowly opened the massive digital document. As I read the dense legal paragraphs, a profound feeling of absolute disgust washed completely over my entire body. Cameron had realized that sending thugs to intimidate me was absolutely useless against the heavily fortified farm. So he had immediately pivoted to a far more sinister and completely devastating legal strategy. The digital document was a formal legal petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. Cameron had officially filed an urgent request with the state court to declare me entirely mentally incompetent. He had actively hired a corrupt private physician to draft a completely fabricated psychological evaluation without ever examining me in person. The fake medical report claimed that the sudden grief of losing Beatrice had triggered a rapid and severe onset of paranoid dementia. Cameron was officially telling a state judge that I was suffering from extreme violent delusions and that I posed a severe physical danger to myself and to the general public. His ultimate legal endgame was absolutely sickening to read. By having me legally declared insane, Cameron was aggressively petitioning the court to grant him immediate and total control over all of my physical and financial assets. He wanted the state authorities to forcefully drag me out of the data center, lock me inside a highly restrictive psychiatric ward, and hand him the absolute legal authority to bulldoze the entire property. He was actively trying to completely erase my basic human rights and strip away my complete bodily autonomy just to secure a massive real estate tax write-off for his bankrupt company. I stared intensely at the digital signature on the bottom of the court petition. It belonged entirely to Cameron. My own son was entirely willing to completely destroy the remaining healthy years of my life. He was perfectly willing to lock his own father inside a padded room just to save his fragile executive ego and impress his greedy wife, Vanessa. The absolute depth of his cruel betrayal eliminated any remaining trace of paternal hesitation I held in my heart. He had officially crossed a line that could never under any circumstances be uncrossed. A normal man would have panicked entirely. A normal man would have frantically started calling expensive defense attorneys to fight the fake medical evaluation in a long and highly embarrassing public court battle. But I was not going to play defense against my own son. I am a retired structural engineer. I know perfectly well that when a building is rotting from the inside, you do not waste time painting the walls. You detonate the foundation. Beatrice had handed me the ultimate financial weapon, and it was finally time to swing it with absolute devastating force. I reached across the cold aluminum desk and picked up my secure cell phone. I did not search for a medical lawyer. I scrolled directly to the private contact number for Sullivan. He was the cold and highly ruthless corporate attorney who had read my wife's will just 24 hours ago. The phone rang only twice before his deep professional voice answered the line. He simply stated his last name, waiting for my response. I did not bother with any polite pleasantries. I leaned forward in my ergonomic chair, looking directly at the live financial feeds of Cameron's fraudulent bank accounts glowing on the wide monitor. My voice was completely steady and entirely devoid of any mercy. "Sullivan," I said calmly, "I have fully reviewed the master ledger for Ironclad Holdings. I want you to draft the necessary corporate documents immediately. Trigger the absolute acceleration clause on the San Francisco Penthouse. Give Cameron the mandatory 72-hour notice. I want every single penny of that $9 million mortgage called in today." I sat in the quiet hum of the server room, listening to the live audio feed from the cell phone belonging to Cameron. Beatrice had designed the data center architecture to automatically intercept any device connected to the corporate network. Because my son always used his company phone for personal matters, I had absolute, complete access to his microphone, his camera, and his global positioning data. He was currently 50 miles away, standing on the expensive teak deck of a rented luxury yacht anchored in the San Francisco Bay. Through the incredibly clear audio feed, I could hear the loud popping of premium champagne corks, the obnoxious laughter of his wealthy friends, and the heavy thumping bass of electronic dance music. He was celebrating his completely fake success while actively drinking $1,000 bottles of wine. He was completely unaware that the massive legal shockwave I had just initiated was already speeding directly toward his location. Sullivan had not wasted a single minute after our phone call. He immediately hired a premium private process server who specialized in tracking down highly evasive individuals. The audio feed on my wide, curved monitor crackled slightly as the loud party music suddenly dipped in volume. I heard a strange professional voice approach Cameron over the loud chatter of the intoxicated guests. The man asked if he was currently speaking to Cameron. My son answered with his usual dripping arrogance, angrily asking the stranger how he managed to get past the strict marina security detail. The man did not argue or attempt to explain himself at all. He simply stated that Cameron was officially served with legal papers, and I heard the heavy slap of a thick envelope hitting the wooden deck table. I leaned much closer to the audio speakers inside the chilled data center. I heard the sharp tearing of heavy paper as Cameron aggressively ripped open the thick envelope. For several long, agonizing seconds, there was absolutely no sound from him at all. The loud party continued cheerfully around him, but the voice of my son was completely absent from the audio feed. I knew exactly what words he was reading. The legal document drafted by Ironclad Holdings was completely merciless and legally impenetrable. It formally notified him that the $9 million commercial mortgage attached to his luxury penthouse was being fully accelerated due to breach of contract. He had exactly 72 hours to wire the entire principal balance to a secure holding account managed by Sullivan. If he failed to produce the $9 million, the property would face immediate and total foreclosure, and he would be physically evicted by the armed county sheriff. The sheer visceral panic that gripped him was instant and completely audible over the server speakers. I heard his heavy, frantic breathing through the phone microphone. He began shouting violently at his wealthy guests, telling them to get off the luxury boat immediately. He was screaming at the professional yacht captain to return the massive vessel to the dock right that second. The arrogant tech chief executive officer was completely dissolving into a terrified, panicking child. Once the yacht was cleared, I tracked his digital location moving rapidly toward his expensive sports car, parked at the marina. As soon as the powerful engine roared to life, he frantically dialed his wife Vanessa. I carefully routed the phone call directly through the main server speakers so I could hear both sides of their incredibly desperate conversation. Vanessa answered the phone with a cheerful, arrogant tone, asking if the expensive yacht party was fun and if the guests were impressed. Cameron screamed at her to shut up immediately. He told her they were completely ruined and about to lose absolutely everything. He frantically explained the heavy legal document he had just received from a mysterious shadow corporation called Ironclad Holdings. He read the strict 72-hour foreclosure notice out loud to her, while his voice cracked with pure fear. Vanessa did not panic at first. She immediately demanded that they just sell the luxury penthouse. She confidently stated that the San Francisco real estate market was incredibly hot right now, and they could easily find a desperate cash buyer in 3 days to pay off the mysterious debt and walk away with a massive profit. Her profound financial ignorance made me shake my head slowly in the dark server room. Cameron screamed even louder, hitting his leather steering wheel with his bare hands in pure, utter frustration. He finally confessed the massive dark secret he had been hiding even from his own greedy wife. He told Vanessa that they absolutely could not sell the penthouse because he had already secretly pledged the property deed as collateral for a $4 million illegal bridge loan from an offshore shadow syndicate. He explained that if they even tried to list the property for sale, a mandatory state title search would instantly reveal the massive secondary lien. The incredibly dangerous offshore lenders would immediately realize their physical collateral was completely compromised, and the federal banking authorities would be automatically alerted to the massive international wire fraud. The dead silence on the other end of the phone was incredibly deeply satisfying. Vanessa had married Cameron purely for his supposed immense wealth and luxury lifestyle. Now she was staring directly down the barrel of total financial devastation and massive federal prison time. When she finally managed to speak, her voice trembled with absolute raw terror. She asked him what the offshore lenders would do to them if they lost the penthouse to the ironclad foreclosure. Cameron did not hold back the brutal, terrifying truth. He told her the shadow syndicate would not just file a simple civil lawsuit. They were incredibly dangerous criminals who would send highly violent men to extract the $4 million in blood. They were completely trapped in an inescapable cage of their own making. But then the desperate conversation took a very dark and highly calculated turn. Vanessa was incredibly greedy, but she was also incredibly cunning when she was backed into a corner. I listened closely as her panicked, rapid breathing slowly steadied into a cold and highly calculated rhythm. She told Cameron to pull the car over, stop driving, and listen to her very carefully. She reminded him of the very night they threw me out into the freezing, pouring rain. When I packed my 2 black trash bags, I had intentionally left behind my bulky old desktop computer in the private study of the luxury penthouse. I had left it because it was completely outdated hardware, and I already knew Beatrice had secured a much faster terminal for me at the farm. Vanessa explained her sinister plan with a chilling level of total calm. She knew I had used that specific desktop computer to manage all of my personal banking and legal documents for the past 5 years. She told Cameron that my computer automatically filled in all of my secure passwords and contained my verified electronic signature software. She loudly rationalized that since I was just a useless old man who did not deserve the inheritance, it was perfectly fine to take it from me. Her idea was absolutely horrifying in its pure criminal ambition. Since the massive farm property was legally in my name and heavily zoned for commercial development, she suggested they log into my computer, forge my electronic signature on a digital property transfer, and sell the Sonoma farm out from under me entirely without my knowledge. Cameron hesitated for a brief moment, but his absolute terror of the violent offshore loan sharks quickly overpowered any remaining shred of human morality. Vanessa laid out the aggressive timeline perfectly. They would forge my signature tonight and list the farm on a private shadow real estate network tomorrow morning. Because commercial developers were always absolutely desperate for large plots of land near Silicon Valley, they could easily demand a massive cash payment and close the illicit deal within 48 hours. They would use the stolen farm money to pay off the terrifying shadow lenders, and then figure out a way to satisfy the ironclad holdings mortgage before the strict 72-hour deadline officially expired. They were actively planning to commit massive federal identity theft and severe real estate fraud against me just to save their own miserable lives. They truly thought I was just a helpless, ignorant old man sleeping on the dirt floor of a wet barn, completely unaware of the modern digital world. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting inside a multi-million-dollar corporate data center listening to every single word they spoke. I reached across the cold aluminum desk and opened the advanced security protocols for my old desktop computer located in their penthouse. I was absolutely not going to stop them from breaking into my personal machine. In fact, I was going to intentionally lower the firewall, disable the two-factor authentication alerts, and let them walk right into the most devastating federal trap of their entire lives. The peaceful silence inside the massive data center was absolute, but my entire focus was directed at the glowing curved monitor on the aluminum desk. When Beatrice and I first moved into the San Francisco penthouse 5 years ago, she had insisted on installing a completely invisible network of high-definition surveillance cameras. She told me it was simply for insurance purposes to protect our expensive belongings from potential theft. But as I watched the live video stream originating from my private locked study, I realized she had installed the cameras to protect us from the very people living inside our home. The primary camera was hidden perfectly inside a customized wall clock, giving me an entirely unobstructed view of my heavy mahogany desk and the thick wooden door. I watched the brass handle of the study door rattle violently. Vanessa was standing out in the hallway, aggressively trying to force her way into my private sanctuary. I had locked the door before Cameron threw me out into the storm, but she was absolutely determined to get inside. She stepped back from the door and retrieved a heavy metal paperweight from the hallway console table. Without a single moment of hesitation, she smashed the solid metal weight directly against the brass locking mechanism. The expensive wood splintered instantly, and the lock gave way with a loud crack. She pushed the door open and hurried into the dark room. She did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. She moved entirely by the dim glow of the city streetlights, filtering through the large windows. She looked exactly like a common criminal breaking into a house in the middle of the night. She walked directly over to my old desktop computer and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated her face in a pale blue light. She looked completely frantic, but there was also a deeply disturbing look of pure, greedy excitement in her eyes. From my position inside the server room, I did not just watch her through the wall clock camera. I opened a secondary secure window on my massive monitor that completely mirrored the exact digital display of my old desktop computer. I could clearly see her physical movements in the room, and I could simultaneously watch every single click of her mouse. She was actively hunting through my personal digital files with absolute ruthless efficiency. She completely bypassed my family photo albums and my old engineering blueprints. She went straight into my highly private financial folders. It took her less than 4 minutes to locate the specific software application that managed all of my official legal documents. This was the exact program I used to digitally sign my tax returns and manage my retirement funds. She opened a blank property transfer template, and her fingers began flying rapidly across the keyboard. I watched the mirrored screen as she aggressively typed in the legal address of the Sonoma farm. She was officially drafting a complete quitclaim deed, formally transferring the entire ownership of the 50-acre property directly from my name into Cameron's corporate holding company. She did not show a single ounce of remorse or hesitation. She was entirely focused on stealing my inheritance to save her own miserable luxury lifestyle. She finished typing the legal transfer language and moved the mouse directly over the final execution button. This was the exact moment that required my verified electronic signature to make the document legally binding. She clicked the button with absolute confidence. But the system immediately paused her progress. A bright red warning box flashed onto her screen. It was a mandatory two-factor authentication security checkpoint. The software strictly required a unique 6-digit passcode that had just been sent directly to my personal cell phone. Vanessa froze completely in the dark study. She stared at the red warning box in absolute horror. She slowly realized that she could not steal the farm without having physical access to my phone. I watched her shoulders slump heavily as she buried her face in her hands, letting out a quiet cry of total frustration. She thought she had completely failed to save herself, but I was absolutely not going to let her fail. If she stopped right now, it would only be a minor case of attempted unauthorized access. That was absolutely not enough to put her in a federal prison. I needed her to fully execute the crime from start to finish. I needed a completely undeniable digital paper trail proving massive felony real estate fraud. I placed my hands on the cold aluminum desk inside the server room. I accessed the master administrative controls for my personal network. With a few rapid keystrokes, I intentionally bypassed the strict security firewall on my old desktop computer. I manually commanded the system to accept the authentication requirement without actually entering the 6-digit passcode. I essentially opened the heavy vault door and stepped entirely out of her way so she could destroy herself. Back in the dark study, Vanessa gasped loudly as the bright red warning box suddenly vanished from her screen. The secure software glitched for a fraction of a second and then officially verified the security checkpoint. She did not pause to question why the system suddenly let her through the barrier. She was far too desperate and far too arrogant to ever consider that she was walking directly into a massive digital trap engineered by a man she considered useless. She immediately grabbed the mouse and selected my verified electronic signature profile. I watched calmly as she stamped my legal name onto the bottom of the forged property transfer document. The digital system chimed softly, confirming that the deed was now officially executed and legally binding. She had just stolen my property, and she had just committed a massive federal felony carrying a minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. I immediately downloaded the complete high-definition video file of her breaking into the room and executing the forgery. I also successfully captured the raw digital metadata from the server, proving exactly what time the signature was applied and which specific computer was used to commit the crime. The collected evidence was absolutely ironclad and mathematically perfect. Vanessa quickly saved the forged document to a portable flash drive and shut down the computer. She ran out of the dark study, leaving the splintered wooden door hanging wide open in her wake. Less than 10 minutes later, the audio feed from Cameron's phone crackled to life on my data center speakers. Vanessa had rushed the stolen flash drive directly to him. His voice was shaking with pure adrenaline as he praised her for successfully stealing the farm. But they still faced a massive, terrifying ticking clock. They had less than 60 hours remaining to pay the $9 million ironclad holdings mortgage before they lost their luxury penthouse entirely. Cameron knew perfectly well he could not list the stolen farm on the traditional public real estate market. A normal commercial sale would take several months of strict legal inspections and lengthy banking procedures to clear. They desperately needed millions of dollars in cold, hard cash by tomorrow afternoon to survive the impending foreclosure. Cameron immediately booted up his own encrypted laptop. I tracked his internet traffic as he actively bypassed the standard commercial property networks. He navigated deeply into a highly unregulated shadow commercial real estate market. This was a completely private digital space where incredibly wealthy anonymous buyers purchased massive plots of land with untraceable liquid cash, usually to rapidly hide their massive assets from the federal government. Cameron quickly uploaded the forged quitclaim deed and aggressively created a new property listing for the Sonoma farm. He set the initial asking price at $12 million, but he added an incredibly desperate condition to the listing. He demanded an immediate 24-hour cash closing with absolutely no physical property inspections allowed by the buyer. He was practically screaming to the dark web that he was a completely desperate man, bleeding out and begging for a rapid financial rescue. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and took a slow sip of my cold coffee. He was actively hunting for a highly predatory buyer to save his life. He had absolutely no idea that I had already instructed Sullivan to prepare a massive pile of untraceable cash, just waiting perfectly to answer his desperate call. I sat perfectly still inside the climate-controlled server room, watching the digital timer on my curved monitor tick downward. Cameron had listed the Sonoma farm on the Shadow Real Estate Network just a few hours ago. His listing was a beacon of pure financial desperation. He was begging for $12 million in liquid cash and demanding a closing window of less than 24 hours. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, demanding a 24-hour cash closing with absolutely no physical property inspections is the equivalent of firing a flare gun from a sinking ship. He was terrified of the offshore loan sharks, and he was terrified of the Ironclad Holdings foreclosure notice. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Sullivan. I told the attorney that the bait was officially in the water, and it was time to close the jaws of the trap. Sullivan operates with the ruthless precision of a military tactician. Less than 20 minutes after my phone call, a massive cash offer appeared directly on Cameron's private digital listing. The offer was for the exact asking price of $12 million. The prospective buyer was listed as Zenith Global Logistics, which appeared on paper to be an aggressive multinational technology conglomerate, looking to rapidly expand their Western data infrastructure. I routed the audio feed from Cameron's penthouse directly into the server room speakers. I heard him literally scream with pure joy when the $12 million notification hit his laptop screen. He yelled for Vanessa, telling her that they were completely saved. He bragged loudly about his incredible business acumen, claiming he had completely outsmarted the real estate market and successfully liquidated my inheritance before I even knew it was gone. His arrogant celebration echoed through the cold server room, but I felt absolutely nothing but deep pity for his total ignorance. Cameron truly believed he was selling the farm to a massive anonymous corporation. He had absolutely no idea that Zenith Global Logistics did not actually exist anywhere outside of a digital ledger. It was a completely hollow shell corporation set up by Sullivan over a decade ago at the strict direction of my late wife, Beatrice. When Beatrice built her hidden empire, she did not just invest in physical servers and fiber optic cables. She maintained massive pools of liquid capital securely hidden behind layers of anonymous corporate entities, just to protect our assets from hostile tech acquisitions. Ironclad Holdings was the primary vault, and Zenith Global Logistics was simply a transactional ghost. Through the brilliant legal architecture my wife left behind, I was literally using my own money to buy my own farm back from my own son. As a retired structural engineer, I know that the most effective traps are the ones where the target actively builds the cage around themselves. By setting up the transaction this way, I was completely sealing his fate on a strictly federal level. When Vanessa forged my signature on the quitclaim deed, she committed standard identity theft. But by actively selling the stolen property across state lines to a corporate entity and accepting millions of dollars in fraudulent proceeds, Cameron was escalating the crime to aggravated federal wire fraud and massive money laundering. He was permanently documenting his own felony with every single digital signature he eagerly provided to Zenith Global Logistics. He rapidly signed the mandatory waiver of physical inspection without a second thought. He blindly signed the expedited title transfer documents. He was so incredibly blinded by his own greed and his absolute terror of the offshore lenders that he never once stopped to question why a massive corporate conglomerate would blindly hand over $12 million for a piece of land they had never even physically seen. I watched the mirrored digital display on my monitor as the escrow process accelerated at a terrifying speed. Sullivan used his immense legal authority and his deep connections in the financial sector to completely bypass the standard banking delays, pushing the massive transaction through private federal clearinghouses. The night dragged on outside the fortified walls of my data center. I brewed another cup of freeze-dried coffee and monitored the live feeds. Cameron and Vanessa stayed awake the entire night, pacing back and forth in their luxury San Francisco penthouse. They were drinking expensive wine and nervously watching their bank account dashboard refresh every few minutes. They were completely exhausted, but entirely fueled by the desperate hope of ultimate financial salvation. They truly believed they had committed the perfect crime. As the bright morning sun began to rise over the Sonoma Valley, the final digital checkpoint was officially cleared. The entire real estate transaction was legally recognized and validated by the shadow market servers. A massive green notification flashed across both of our screens simultaneously. The $12 million wire transfer from Zenith Global Logistics had officially cleared into Cameron's private corporate account. The massive influx of capital immediately turned his negative balances into a staggering fortune. I heard Vanessa shriek with absolute delight over the audio feed. She immediately began talking about buying a massive diamond necklace and booking a first-class flight to Paris to celebrate their absolute genius victory over me. But Cameron did not celebrate with her. The absolute second the funds became available, his pure survival instinct completely took over his brain. He knew the incredibly dangerous Shadow Syndicate was still actively hunting him for their $4 million bridge loan. He knew those violent men did not care about real estate contracts or corporate excuses. He completely ignored his wife's greedy rambling and immediately opened an highly encrypted international wire transfer window on his laptop. He was terrified that the loan sharks would send armed men to the luxury penthouse if he delayed the payment by even a single hour. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold aluminum desk, as I watched him rapidly type in the routing numbers for the offshore bank located deep in the Cayman Islands. He was frantically trying to pay off his physical threats before securing his legal ones. He entered the exact transfer amount of $4 million and slammed his trembling finger down onto the execution key. Because the shadow market operates completely outside of standard banking regulations, the system processed the massive international request almost instantly. I watched the digital data packets flow directly through the fiber optic cables buried right beneath my heavy work boots. $4 million of my own money vanished from his account and was securely routed directly into the dark offshore syndicate. Cameron let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief that was so incredibly loud, it completely distorted the tiny microphone on his laptop. He told Vanessa that the loan sharks were finally paid off, and they were officially safe from physical harm. He looked lovingly at the remaining $8 million sitting comfortably in his account. He confidently stated that they were going to use those remaining funds to somehow negotiate a settlement on the Ironclad Holdings mortgage and keep the luxury penthouse forever. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, entirely convinced that he had just won the ultimate war. He had absolutely no idea that I was resting my finger right over the ultimate federal kill switch, just waiting for the perfect second to strike. The heavy sigh of relief from Cameron echoed through the cold server room. He truly believed he had survived the darkest storm of his life. By paying off the $4 million debt to the offshore loan sharks, he thought he had completely eliminated the immediate physical threat to his safety. I sat in the ergonomic chair and watched his laptop screen mirror directly onto my massive curved monitor. He had exactly $8 million remaining in his corporate holding account. That was still a massive fortune by any normal standard. But Vanessa was not a normal woman. Her greed was an absolute bottomless pit. I listened to the audio feed as she walked up behind his expensive leather chair and wrapped her arms around his neck. She began whispering poison directly into his ear. She told him that they could not leave the remaining $8 million sitting in his corporate account. She argued that Ironclad Holdings might try to seize the corporate assets when the 72-hour foreclosure deadline finally expired. Her logic was entirely rooted in pure criminal self-preservation. She demanded that he wire the remaining balance entirely into a private offshore banking account, registered exclusively in her maiden name. Cameron was exhausted and completely mentally drained from the frantic events of the past 24 hours. He did not possess the strength to argue with her relentless demands. He blindly agreed to her sinister plan. I watched his fingers move across the keyboard as he opened a new international wire transfer window. He began typing in the complex routing numbers for a highly secretive bank located in the Bahamas. He was actively attempting to completely wash the remaining stolen funds and hide them entirely outside of federal jurisdiction. This was the exact critical moment I had been waiting for all morning. I moved my hands away from my coffee cup and placed them firmly onto the cold, brushed aluminum desk. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication portal that Beatrice had custom-built into the server infrastructure. I had already prepared the massive digital evidence package hours ago. It was a perfectly organized folder containing every single piece of undeniable proof. It held the crystal-clear 4K resolution video of Vanessa physically breaking into my locked study. It contained the raw, unedited footage of her sitting at my desk and manually executing the forged quitclaim deed. It included the exact digital server logs proving the exact time and location of the fraudulent signature. It also contained the complete transaction history of Cameron listing the stolen farm on the illegal shadow market and accepting the $12 million from Zenith Global Logistics. It was a complete masterclass in documenting a federal felony. I did not need to hire a team of expensive lawyers to build a case. I had built an absolute digital guillotine. I routed the massive data package directly to the primary cybercrime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in San Francisco. I simultaneously sent a duplicate copy to the Emergency Fraud Prevention Department of the Federal Banking Commission. These agencies utilized automated threat detection systems that actively monitored for massive international wire transfers associated with stolen identities. I did not hesitate for even a single fraction of a second. As Cameron hovered his mouse cursor directly over the final execution button to send the $8 million to his wife, I pressed the enter key on my secure terminal. The massive encrypted data package fired through the fiber optic cables at the speed of light. It hit the federal servers exactly 2 seconds before Cameron clicked his mouse. I watched the mirrored digital display of his laptop with absolute total focus. He clicked the button, expecting to see the familiar green checkmark, confirming the successful international transfer. But the screen did not turn green. The software system completely froze for 5 agonizing seconds. A tiny loading circle spun endlessly in the direct center of his monitor. I heard him tap the screen with his finger, muttering under his breath about the terrible internet connection in the luxury penthouse. He had absolutely no idea that his internet connection was working perfectly. He was simply experiencing the terrifying real-time delay of a massive federal banking freeze. Suddenly, the entire screen flashed a brilliant, blinding red. A massive warning notification locked down his entire banking interface. The bold black text on his screen was absolutely merciless. It stated that the account was permanently frozen due to suspected federal wire fraud and international money laundering. It instructed the account holder to immediately contact the Federal Banking Commission and warned that any further attempts to access the funds would result in immediate physical arrest. The absolute dead silence that fell over the luxury penthouse was incredibly profound. I could hear the faint sound of the city traffic far below their window, but inside the room neither Cameron nor Vanessa took a single breath. Then the pure, unadulterated panic completely shattered the silence. Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs. She frantically pulled out her own personal cell phone and opened her private banking application. The exact same red warning screen instantly appeared on her device. She ran to her expensive designer purse and pulled out her premium black credit cards. She logged into the credit portal and discovered that every single line of credit she possessed was entirely suspended. The federal banking authorities had not just frozen the stolen farm money. They had initiated a total comprehensive lockdown of every single financial asset connected to their names. They were completely and utterly trapped. Cameron jumped out of his leather chair so violently that it crashed backward onto the expensive hardwood floor. He began tearing at his own hair, pacing the room like a completely trapped wild animal. He screamed that the offshore loan sharks were going to realize his accounts were frozen. He knew the Shadow Syndicate constantly monitored the financial health of their desperate clients. He shouted that the federal government was probably already drafting arrest warrants for the forged property deed. His entire fake luxury empire had completely evaporated in less than 10 seconds. He had absolutely no money to hire a defense attorney. He had no money to flee the country. He did not even have enough active credit to buy a tank of gas. Vanessa collapsed onto the expensive Italian sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. She blamed Cameron for everything. She screamed that he was completely incompetent and that his stupid tech startup had ruined her entire life. She yelled that they needed to call my cell phone immediately and beg me to somehow fix the banking error. She still somehow believed I was just a helpless old man who could be easily manipulated with a fake apology. But Cameron was no longer operating on any level of rational logic. His deep panic was rapidly mutating into a very dark and highly violent physical rage. I listened closely as his heavy footsteps stomped rapidly across the penthouse floor. He walked directly into the master bedroom and forcefully opened the heavy steel door of his biometric wall safe. I knew exactly what he kept inside that safe. It was not jewelry or important documents. It was a heavy-caliber semi-automatic handgun he had purchased illegally 2 years ago, claiming he needed it for personal protection in the city. The cold metallic sound of the heavy slide racking around into the chamber echoed through the audio feed with terrifying absolute clarity. He walked back into the living room. His breathing was incredibly heavy and erratic. He told Vanessa to shut her mouth immediately. His voice was completely devoid of any human empathy or reason. He stated that the federal banking freeze had to be a direct result of the quitclaim deed transfer. He blindly assumed that the automated banking software had simply flagged my electronic signature as highly suspicious because I was an older man making a massive real estate transaction. He truly believed that if he could just force me to physically call the Federal Banking Commission and verbally authorize the transfer, they would immediately unfreeze the $8 million. Vanessa cried out, asking him what he was doing with the weapon. Cameron coldly replied that he was done playing legal games with a useless old man. He stated that he was driving directly up to the Sonoma farm right now. He declared that he would drag me out of that rotting barn, put the cold steel barrel directly against my head, and force me to fix the massive banking error. If I refused, he promised he would leave my body in the thick mud and figure out another way to escape the country. I heard the heavy front door of the luxury penthouse slam shut violently. He was currently rushing down to the underground parking garage, fueled by pure violent adrenaline and absolute terror. I sat completely still inside the fortified server room. I did not feel any fear as I listened to his expensive sports car roar out of the city, heading directly toward my location. He was bringing a handgun to a fully automated federal data facility. I slowly reached out and activated the secondary exterior defense protocols. I was completely ready for my son to arrive. The massive high-definition monitors inside the climate-controlled server room flickered violently as the exterior motion sensors detected a vehicle approaching the property at a highly reckless speed. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair and watched the live digital video feed. It was not the heavy black luxury vehicle of the private security contractors from the night before. It was Cameron's incredibly expensive European sports car. He was driving entirely out of control, swerving dangerously across the deep, thick mud of the country road. He slammed heavily on the brakes, just a few inches away from the massive reinforced, armored steel security gates that I had dropped during the initial perimeter lockdown. The expensive low-profile tires of his car spun aggressively in the wet dirt, spraying heavy, thick mud all over the pristine silver paint job. He threw the transmission into park and kicked the driver's side door open with intense force. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, wealthy tech chief executive officer who had cruelly thrown me out of the luxury penthouse just 48 hours ago. His expensive tailored designer suit was deeply wrinkled and completely ruined by the pouring rain from earlier. His silk tie was completely undone, hanging loosely around his neck. His hair was a chaotic mess, and his face was twisted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated desperation and panic. He marched directly up to the heavy steel gates and began bashing his bare fists violently against the thick armored metal bars. I watched him scream frantically into the cold afternoon air for several long minutes. He was completely out of his mind with pure financial terror. I could have simply stayed inside the impenetrable digital fortress and ignored him entirely. The reinforced concrete walls of the data center were practically bomb-proof, and there was absolutely no physical way he could ever breach the facility on his own. But I am a retired structural engineer. I know perfectly well that when a massive compromised structure is actively collapsing, you need to stand exactly in the right place to watch the final foundational beams give way so you can properly assess the complete destruction. I needed to look my own son directly in the eyes, as his entire fraudulent empire burned entirely to the ground. I pushed my chair back from the cold, brushed aluminum desk and stood up. I did not bother to put on a heavy winter coat. I simply walked down the long, bright, illuminated corridor of the server room and approached the heavy secondary security doors. I pressed my hand against the biometric scanner, and the thick pneumatic locks hissed loudly as they disengaged. I stepped out into the damp, chilling air of the Sonoma Valley. The heavy, violent storm from the previous night had completely passed, but the ground was still an absolute swamp of thick, heavy mud and deep, cold puddles. I walked very slowly and deliberately down the long gravel path toward the massive steel gates. Cameron saw me walking calmly toward him, and his violent screaming instantly escalated to a completely deafening volume. He grabbed the thick, cold steel bars of the gate with both of his hands and shook them with all of his remaining physical strength. He violently demanded that I open the gates immediately. He screamed repeatedly that I had somehow ruined his entire life and that I needed to fix the massive banking error right this exact second. I did not say a single word to him until I was standing just 3 feet away, separated only by the heavy armored steel bars. I looked deeply into his bloodshot eyes and noticed his heavily sweating forehead. His chest was heaving violently as he struggled desperately to catch his breath in the cold air. When he finally realized that his loud, aggressive shouting was having absolutely no emotional effect on my calm demeanor, his deep internal panic finally boiled over into lethal physical violence. He reached entirely behind his back and pulled out the heavy-caliber semi-automatic handgun he had frantically taken from his biometric wall safe back at the luxury penthouse. He raised the dark metallic weapon and pointed the barrel directly at my chest through the narrow gaps in the steel gate. His hands were shaking so incredibly violently that the front sight of the weapon vibrated wildly in the cold afternoon air. He told me he was absolutely not playing any more legal games. His voice was a truly pathetic and terrifying mixture of absolute raw terror and homicidal rage. He violently demanded that I pull out my cell phone right now, call the Federal Banking Commission, and verbally authorize the immediate release of his frozen $8 million. He actually truly believed in his panicked state that holding a deadly weapon to my chest would somehow magically erase the massive digital trail of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and international money laundering he had committed entirely by himself. He aggressively threatened to pull the heavy trigger and leave me bleeding to death in the cold farm mud if I did not do exactly what he commanded. I stood perfectly still in the freezing wind. My heart rate did not elevate at all. My breathing remained completely slow and highly calculated. I looked directly down the dark, hollow barrel of the loaded weapon, and then I slowly raised my eyes to meet his incredibly terrified gaze. I spoke to him with a voice so incredibly cold and entirely steady that it actually made him take a tiny, involuntary step backward into the deep mud. I told Cameron that he was pointing a loaded firearm at a man who had absolutely nothing left in this world to lose. I explained very calmly that I did not own the Federal Banking Commission, and I possessed absolutely no magical legal authority to unfreeze his stolen money. I told him the corporate bank accounts were permanently locked down because he had actively and willingly committed massive federal crimes that could never, under any circumstances, be erased from the digital ledgers. I told him he had built a house entirely out of pure greed, and now the foundation was completely shattered. But more importantly, I slowly raised my right hand and pointed a single finger high up toward the reinforced roofline of the massive facility standing right behind me. I told him to look very closely at the 4 high-definition security cameras that were currently tracking his exact physical movements. I explained clearly that those specific tactical cameras were not just recording video data to a local computer hard drive. They were currently maintaining a live, unbroken encrypted uplink directly to the County Sheriff Emergency Dispatch Center. I told him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already flagged his banking profile for massive wire fraud, and now the local law enforcement agencies were watching him actively commit armed assault against an unarmed senior citizen in real time. To completely validate my calm statement, a faint but highly distinct sound began to echo through the quiet open valleys of the Sonoma countryside. It was the sharp, piercing wail of multiple heavy police sirens approaching rapidly from the main public highway. The automated threat detection software I had triggered earlier had completely bypassed standard emergency response times. Heavily armed tactical police units were already closing in on the farm from multiple directions. Cameron froze completely in his tracks. The absolute terrifying reality of his completely doomed situation finally crashed down upon him like a massive concrete block dropped from a towering skyscraper. He looked up at the glowing red recording lights on the security cameras, and then he looked down at the heavy, deadly weapon in his severely trembling hand. He suddenly realized with absolute clarity that he was totally out of time. If he stayed at the steel gates for even 2 more minutes, he would be completely surrounded by heavily armed police officers thrown directly down into the mud and dragged straight into a federal holding cell. His basic animal survival instinct completely hijacked his rational brain. He dropped the expensive, heavy-caliber handgun directly into the deep, wet mud at his feet. He did not say another word to me. He spun around wildly and sprinted frantically back to his idling, expensive sports car. He threw the vehicle into gear and slammed his foot entirely down on the accelerator pedal. The tires screamed loudly against the wet pavement as he sped off desperately toward the main highway. He was completely and utterly abandoning his incredibly greedy wife, Vanessa, back at the San Francisco penthouse, leaving her to face the furious offshore loan sharks entirely by herself. He was making a completely desperate and highly pathetic run for the international airport, hoping to somehow escape the country before the federal borders locked down. I stood quietly behind the heavy steel gates, watching his silver car disappear rapidly into the distance as the loud police sirens grew closer and louder by the second. I sat inside the massive humming server room and switched my primary monitor to the Federal Aviation Administration flight tracking database. I also opened a secure, encrypted channel to the local police scanner. Cameron was completely out of his mind with panic. He had driven his expensive sports car directly to a small private airfield located just outside the city limits. Because his credit cards and bank accounts were entirely frozen by the Federal Banking Commission, he had violently ripped his $50,000 platinum watch off his wrist and thrown it at a desperate charter pilot. He demanded an immediate undocumented flight across the southern border into Mexico. He truly believed that a piece of expensive jewelry could somehow buy his freedom from the massive federal trap he had willingly walked into. Through the audio feed on his cell phone, I could hear the loud whining pitch of the small jet engines spinning up on the wet tarmac. Cameron was breathing heavily as he ran across the concrete, holding his ruined designer suit jacket over his head to block the freezing rain. He thought he had successfully escaped the consequences of his extreme greed. He had absolutely no idea that the federal authorities were already actively tracking his digital location through the very phone he kept inside his pocket. He was only a few feet away from the metal stairs of the private plane when the loud audio feed suddenly erupted into absolute chaos. Multiple heavy black vehicles completely swarmed the private runway. The incredibly loud screech of heavy tires skidding on wet concrete drowned out the sound of the plane engines. I listened with cold satisfaction as the doors of the tactical vehicles slammed open. Several federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured out onto the tarmac. They were heavily armed and entirely uncompromising. They screamed at Cameron to get down on the wet ground immediately. He tried to run toward the metal stairs, but his leather shoes slipped completely on the slick concrete. He fell heavily onto his knees. The federal agents descended upon him instantly. I heard the harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists. The lead federal agent read him his rights in a loud, clear voice over the roaring wind. He was formally placed under federal arrest for massive international wire fraud and severe corporate embezzlement. The local county sheriff had also filed immediate state charges for his violent armed assault at the farm gates. Cameron began sobbing uncontrollably on the wet tarmac. He begged the federal agents to let him go, claiming that it was all a massive misunderstanding and blaming his wife for the forged documents. He sounded like a terrified small child. He was completely stripped of his arrogant executive persona. The federal agents ignored his pathetic crying entirely. They hauled him roughly off the wet concrete and threw him directly into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle. His fake tech empire had officially ended in the mud and the freezing rain, just as it was always destined to do. While Cameron was weeping in the back of a federal police vehicle, I shifted my complete focus to the secondary video feed glowing brightly on my curved monitor. The hidden security camera located in the hallway of the San Francisco luxury penthouse showed an entirely different kind of frantic desperation. Vanessa had finally realized that her arrogant husband was completely gone, and he was never coming back for her. She knew the highly dangerous offshore loan sharks were likely already making their way to the building to violently collect their $4 million debt. She was entirely consumed by pure animal survival instinct. She had dragged 3 massive, expensive designer suitcases into the center of the living room. She was frantically running back and forth between the master bedroom and the expensive luggage. She was aggressively sweeping thousands of dollars worth of diamond necklaces, gold bracelets, and premium luxury watches directly into the open bags. She threw her expensive designer dresses and expensive shoes on top of the jewelry. She was absolutely determined to flee the city and live off the massive pile of stolen luxury goods she had accumulated during their fake wealthy marriage. She zipped the heavy suitcases shut and dragged them aggressively toward the heavy oak front door of the penthouse. She reached out and pulled the brass handle, expecting to run down the hallway and disappear into the crowded city streets. But the heavy wooden door opened to reveal a completely impenetrable wall. Sullivan was standing perfectly still in the carpeted hallway right outside the penthouse. He was dressed in a pristine tailored suit, and his face was a mask of absolute cold professional authority. Standing directly behind him were 2 incredibly massive private building security guards wearing dark uniforms and dark sunglasses. Vanessa gasped loudly and took a terrified step backward into the foyer. She tried to quickly slam the heavy door shut in his face, but the massive security guard easily stepped forward and planted his heavy black boot firmly inside the doorframe. Sullivan stepped calmly into the luxurious foyer of the penthouse. He did not raise his voice or show any physical aggression. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents. He handed the heavy papers directly to Vanessa. She took them with severely trembling hands. Sullivan explained the situation with absolutely merciless legal precision. He told her that she was currently holding an official notice of immediate civil asset forfeiture. He clearly explained that because she had actively used the desktop computer located inside this very apartment to commit massive federal wire fraud. The entire property was now legally classified as an active crime scene and a tool of a federal felony. Because Ironclad Holdings legally owned the $9 million commercial mortgage on the penthouse, the corporation had exercised its absolute legal right to seize the physical collateral immediately to prevent the destruction of valuable assets. Sullivan looked directly down at the 3 massive designer suitcases, bulging with expensive stolen jewelry. He informed her in a completely cold tone that every single item inside those bags was purchased with severely embezzled corporate funds. That meant the jewelry and the expensive clothes legally belonged to the federal bankruptcy courts and the defrauded corporate investors. She was absolutely not allowed to take a single valuable item out of the apartment. Vanessa began to scream frantically. She yelled that she was the legal wife of the owner and she had a constitutional right to her own personal belongings. She threatened to call the police and have Sullivan arrested for trespassing. Sullivan simply gestured for the massive security guards to step entirely into the room. He looked at his expensive wristwatch and told her the absolute final truth. He calmly stated that the local police were already on their way to secure the crime scene. He gave her exactly 60 seconds to drop the heavy designer bags and walk out of the building with nothing but the clothes currently on her back. If she refused to leave immediately, the security guards were legally authorized to detain her for attempting to steal frozen federal assets. The absolute reality of her complete destruction finally broke through her endless greed. She looked at the incredibly large security guards and realized she had absolutely no physical or legal power left in the world. She slowly let go of the leather handles on the expensive suitcases. She was hyperventilating, and tears of pure rage were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She walked slowly past Sullivan, stepping out into the cold hallway, completely empty-handed. She had entered my home 5 years ago, demanding total respect and absolute luxury. Now she was being completely thrown out into the dangerous city streets with absolutely no money, no credit cards, and nowhere to go. I watched the video feed as Sullivan calmly reached out and pulled the heavy oak door completely shut. The loud click of the new brass deadbolt engaging echoed loudly through the audio feed, finalizing the absolute eviction of the woman who had tried to destroy my entire life. The sterile fluorescent lights of the Federal Detention Center buzzed with a relentless mechanical hum that reminded me of the server room back at the farm. But the air in this place was entirely different. It was heavy with the distinct smell of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and absolute human despair. I sat perfectly still on a cold metal folding chair in the visitor interrogation area. A thick slab of reinforced plexiglass separated me from the empty chair on the other side. I wore a simple gray sweater and my comfortable work boots. I did not feel any anxiety or sorrow. I was simply waiting to inspect the final results of a structural collapse. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass clanked loudly as a federal corrections officer opened it. Cameron shuffled into the room. He was wearing a bright orange federal jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that rattled loudly against the concrete floor with every single step he took. He looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant tech chief executive officer who had worn a $4,000 tailored suit was entirely gone. His face was pale and deeply hollowed from absolute lack of sleep and pure terror. His hair was a greasy mess, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. He sat down heavily in the metal chair opposite me and stared through the thick glass. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely manage to lift the heavy black telephone receiver from its cradle on the wall. I slowly picked up my own receiver and pressed it against my ear. "Dad, please," he whispered immediately. His voice was a pathetic, broken whimper, completely stripped of any pride. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for pointing a loaded weapon at my chest just 24 hours ago. His entire focus was fixed strictly on his own desperate survival. He begged me to contact Sullivan and authorize his federal bail. He told me the conditions inside the holding cell were absolutely horrifying, and he could not survive another night in this terrible place. He promised me he would do absolutely anything I wanted if I just paid the federal judge to let him walk out of those heavy steel doors. When I did not immediately answer him, his frantic begging rapidly morphed into a desperate, cowardly betrayal. He completely turned on his own wife without a single second of hesitation. He leaned closer to the glass and swore to me that he had absolutely nothing to do with stealing the Sonoma farm. He cried loudly, claiming that Vanessa was a complete sociopath who had manipulated him from the very beginning. He stated that she had broken into my private study entirely on her own and forged my electronic signature while he was completely unaware in the other room. He begged me to believe that he had only accepted the $12 million because he was terrified she would leave him if he did not provide her with a life of absolute luxury. He was actively trying to rewrite the entire history of his incredible greed, casting himself as a helpless, innocent victim of a wicked woman. I let him ramble and cry for 5 full minutes. I simply sat there and watched a grown man completely abandon every single shred of his own personal accountability. When he finally ran out of breath and stared at me with desperate, pleading eyes, I slowly reached into the pocket of my gray sweater. I pulled out my secure cell phone. I did not say a single word to him. I simply pressed the play button on a specific audio file and held the speaker directly against the microphone of my telephone receiver. The crystal-clear audio from the night of the eviction echoed directly into Cameron's ear. He heard his own arrogant, vicious voice entirely unfiltered. He heard himself calling me a useless old man. He heard himself stating that Beatrice had finally realized what a deadbeat I was. He heard himself violently demanding that I pack my garbage bags and get out of his luxury penthouse before midnight. I watched his pale face drain of whatever tiny amount of color he had left. His mouth fell open slightly as the digital echo of his own extreme cruelty played back to him inside the cold federal interrogation room. I pulled the phone away and finally spoke to him. My voice was completely steady and incredibly cold. I told him that an engineer never builds a trap. An engineer simply understands the absolute physical limits of a foundation. I explained that I did not actively destroy his life. I simply handed him the tools and allowed him to completely dismantle his own existence. I calmly laid out the exact architecture of the reality he had completely ignored. I told him about Ironclad Holdings. I told him that Beatrice had secretly funded his entire tech startup and that she legally owned his massive luxury penthouse from the very beginning. His eyes widened in absolute horror as I continued my explanation. I told him the $12 million he had received from Zenith Global Logistics did not come from an anonymous international tech conglomerate. I told him Zenith was a shell corporation managed directly by Sullivan. I watched the devastating realization hit his brain like a physical blow. He realized that he had committed massive federal wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate money laundering just to sell my own property directly back to me using my own money. I told him that if he had simply treated me with a basic fraction of human decency on the night the will was read, I would have happily given him the farm and the entire fortune behind it. He pressed his face against the thick plexiglass, sobbing uncontrollably. He asked me why I hated him so much. He asked me how a father could do something so incredibly cruel to his only son. I looked directly into his crying eyes and told him the absolute truth. I told him this was never about emotional revenge. Revenge is a chaotic, unpredictable emotional response. This was a completely calculated consequence. When a massive building is constructed entirely out of lies and greed, gravity will always eventually pull it down into the dirt. I was simply the gravity. I placed the heavy black receiver back onto the metal cradle. I did not look back at him as the federal guards dragged his chained body away from the glass window. I walked out of the sterile detention facility and stepped into the cool San Francisco afternoon. I pulled out my cell phone to check the secure data logs streaming from the server room back at the farm. The massive digital trap I had engineered had successfully neutralized Cameron, but the immense shockwaves of his incredibly reckless financial decisions were still actively tearing through the city. The advanced federal network monitoring software Beatrice had designed was currently intercepting deeply alarming communications from the dark web. The $4 million Cameron had frantically wired to the offshore bank in the Cayman Islands had triggered an immediate massive red flag within the International Banking Commission. Because the funds originated directly from a highly fraudulent real estate transaction involving stolen federal assets, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had executed an emergency international financial clawback. The overseas banking accounts belonging to the highly dangerous shadow syndicate had been completely frozen, and the $4 million was actively being seized by the United States government. The offshore loan sharks operate entirely on a strict code of absolute violence and total financial return. They did not care that Cameron was currently sitting inside a federal holding cell. They did not care about real estate laws or federal bank freezes. They only knew that $4 million of their money had been completely ripped away from them, and they needed to punish someone severely for the massive theft. Because Cameron was completely locked away behind impenetrable federal steel doors, he was temporarily, completely untouchable. But Vanessa was not in federal prison. Vanessa had been completely thrown out of the luxury penthouse by Sullivan and the building security guards. She was currently wandering the busy streets of San Francisco entirely alone with absolutely no money, no shelter, and no police protection. The encrypted communications on my server logs revealed that the furious Shadow Syndicate was already utilizing their local underground enforcers to actively hunt her down. They were rapidly tracking her digital footprint through the city, desperately looking to extract their $4 million in blood. Cameron had completely abandoned his greedy wife to save his own life, and now the terrible monsters he had invited into their fake luxury empire were turning all of their violent rage directly toward her. The arrest of a prominent tech chief executive officer does not stay quiet for very long in a city like San Francisco. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the financial news networks were completely saturated with the shocking story of the airport interception. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had released a comprehensive public statement confirming the massive wire fraud and severe corporate embezzlement charges. The immediate corporate fallout for the startup was absolutely catastrophic. Cameron's tech company was already secretly bankrupt and bleeding massive amounts of capital, but the public revelation of his illegal offshore loans and forged real estate documents served as the final fatal blow. The remaining corporate investors panicked entirely and pulled all of their funding within a matter of hours. The company's stock valuation plummeted entirely to zero. The corrupt board of directors held an emergency closed-door meeting and immediately filed for total corporate bankruptcy, hoping to quickly liquidate the remaining software assets to somehow save themselves from federal scrutiny and massive civil lawsuits. I watched the entire corporate collapse happen in real time on my wide, curved monitor inside the climate-controlled data center. Beatrice had left me an absolute mountain of liquid capital securely hidden behind the impenetrable walls of ironclad holdings. She had built that massive wealth by patiently playing the long game, and now it was time for me to make my final move on the corporate board. When the federal bankruptcy courts announced a rapid auction to sell off the remaining physical and intellectual assets of the disgraced software company, I instructed Sullivan to register my corporate entity as a completely anonymous bidder. The digital auction took place just 3 days later. Because the tech company was deeply tainted by a massive ongoing federal criminal investigation, traditional venture capitalists absolutely refused to touch it. They treated the entire software company like a highly infectious disease. I sat comfortably at my aluminum desk and watched the secure bidding portal open on my screen. I submitted a single incredibly low bid. I offered to purchase the entire corporate infrastructure, the proprietary software codes, the expensive server hardware, and the remaining commercial leases for absolute pennies on the dollar. It was a completely humiliating valuation for a company Cameron used to arrogantly boast was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Because there were absolutely no other financial competitors willing to take the massive legal risk, the federal bankruptcy judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel and officially approved my single bid in less than 20 minutes. I had just purchased my own son's entire arrogant tech empire using the exact same money Beatrice had quietly earned while he completely ignored her existence. The very next morning, I decided to leave the quiet sanctuary of the Sonoma farm to handle the physical transition. I put on my best tailored suit, the one Beatrice had proudly bought for our 30th wedding anniversary. I drove my beat-up truck directly into downtown San Francisco and parked right in front of the massive glass skyscraper that housed the tech company headquarters. The sprawling marble lobby was completely chaotic with worried employees packing their cardboard boxes, but I walked calmly past the frantic crowds and took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. I walked slowly into the massive glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city skyline. The corrupt board of directors was already sitting nervously around the expensive, polished mahogany table. These were the greedy, arrogant men and women who who had actively enabled Cameron's highly fraudulent lifestyle. They had completely ignored his terrible financial decisions and his toxic corporate culture, as long as he kept promising them massive future profits. They looked up in complete shock when an old retired structural engineer walked into their private sanctuary and sat down directly at the head of the heavy wooden table. I did not bother to introduce myself. I simply opened my leather briefcase and slid a thick stack of legally binding corporate documents across the polished wood. I calmly informed them that Ironclad Holdings was now the absolute sole proprietor of the entire company and that I was their new boss. I watched their arrogant faces completely drop into pale horror as I explained that I was immediately executing a total, comprehensive corporate purge. I fired every single one of them directly on the spot. When the former chairman of the board angrily demanded their expensive severance packages and their contractual golden parachutes, I handed them a secondary document drafted by Sullivan. It clearly proved that their gross financial negligence and their active complicity in Cameron's illegal shadow loans had legally voided all of their executive contracts. I told them they were leaving the building with absolutely nothing, and that the building security guards were already waiting in the hallway to escort them out into the street. I did not just dismantle the corrupt corporate leadership. I completely erased Cameron's entire professional legacy from the tech world in a single incredibly busy afternoon. I immediately brought in a completely new executive team, composed entirely of brilliant ethical software engineers I had personally vetted through Beatrice's massive professional network. I legally changed the name of the company, entirely stripping away any trace of Cameron's existence from the corporate registry. I completely redirected the primary corporate mission toward developing highly secure agricultural software programs to actually help struggling local farmers optimize their crop yields. The fake luxury empire, built entirely on extreme vanity and massive financial fraud, was completely gone forever. In its place, I successfully built a solid practical foundation that would actually provide genuine value to the real world, honoring the true legacy of my late wife. I left the noisy city that afternoon feeling a deep, profound sense of structural completion. The terrible rot had been completely excised from the building, and the new foundation was poured perfectly level and true. I drove back to the peaceful isolation of the Sonoma farm, arriving just as the bright orange sun began to set behind the rolling green hills. I unlocked the heavy armored steel gates and parked my truck safely near the massive wooden facade of the data center. I walked inside, breathed in the cool filtered air, and sat down at the aluminum desk with a fresh hot cup of coffee. I truly believed the absolute worst of the chaotic storm was finally behind me, and I could finally begin to rest in peace. But the digital world never sleeps, and the severe consequences of Cameron's extreme greed were still actively hunting in the dark shadows of the city. Exactly 3 hours after I returned to the farm, the automated exterior perimeter defense system suddenly chimed loudly with a high-priority proximity alert. The infrared night vision cameras automatically focused on the muddy county road leading directly up to my heavy armored gates. I looked closely at the high-definition monitor, entirely expecting to see another group of hired security thugs, or perhaps inquisitive local journalists looking for an exclusive story about the massive tech collapse. But there were no heavy black vehicles, and there were no bright headlights cutting through the darkness. There was only a single solitary figure, walking very slowly up the long gravel driveway entirely on foot. I zoomed the optical camera lens in much closer to get a better look at the lonely intruder. The digital image resolved perfectly on my wide, curved screen, and a cold wave of profound disbelief washed entirely over me. It was Vanessa. The woman who had proudly worn expensive designer dresses and ruthlessly demanded a life of absolute luxury was completely unrecognizable. She was shivering violently in the cold night wind, wearing a dirty, torn sweater and completely ruined expensive shoes that were deeply covered in thick farm mud. Her hair was a chaotic, matted mess, and she had absolutely no designer luggage or expensive bags of any kind. She stumbled exhausted up to the heavy steel gates and grabbed the cold, wet metal bars with both hands. She looked directly up at the glowing red light of the security camera, knowing perfectly well I was watching her from inside. I slowly turned on the exterior audio microphones, and her desperate, pathetic sobbing instantly filled the quiet server room. She was begging me over and over again to open the heavy gates and let her inside the fortified digital compound. She cried loudly that the highly dangerous offshore shadow lenders had successfully tracked her down in the dirty city streets. She screamed that they had completely cornered her in a dark alley and violently promised to do terrible physical things to her if she did not somehow produce their $4 million by tomorrow morning. Cameron had completely abandoned her to the vicious wolves to save his own miserable life, and now those exact same wolves were right on her heels. The arrogant woman who had once demanded I clear out of my own home was now completely broke, entirely terrified, and desperately begging the useless old man for physical protection. I sat inside the secure server room and watched the high-definition monitor with absolute emotional detachment. Vanessa was clinging to the heavy armored steel gates of the farm like a desperate shipwreck survivor clinging to a piece of floating driftwood. The cold night wind was howling through the Sonoma Valley, whipping her tangled, matted hair across her tear-stained face. She had completely lost the arrogant, glamorous aura that she used to wield like a weapon inside the San Francisco luxury penthouse. Her expensive clothes were covered in thick, dark mud, and she was shivering violently against the freezing metal bars. I zoomed the camera lens in closer to observe her facial expressions. She was not crying out of genuine remorse for the terrible things she had done. She was crying out of pure animalistic terror because the violent offshore shadow lenders were actively hunting her through the city streets. She knew she had absolutely nowhere else to hide. She looked directly up at the glowing red light of the security camera and began pleading loudly. I slowly leaned forward in my ergonomic chair and pressed the activation button for the exterior two-way intercom system. The heavy metallic click echoed loudly across the dark farm driveway. Vanessa gasped when she heard the speakers activate. She immediately began talking at a frantic, desperate pace. She told me that she had extremely valuable information about Cameron and his illegal business dealings. She promised she would happily stand up in a federal courtroom and testify against my son. She offered to hand over all of his private passwords and hidden offshore account numbers to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was completely willing to sell her own husband to a federal prison for the rest of his life if I would just open the heavy steel gates and give her a safe place to sleep. She shamelessly begged me for a massive cash payment, claiming she needed money to disappear and start a brand new life far away from the dangerous loan sharks. She actually tried to use her fake tears to manipulate me. She called me dad and sobbed about how she was just a helpless victim who got caught up in Cameron's massive web of lies. She spun a pathetic story about how Cameron had forced her to forge the documents under the threat of physical violence. I knew it was a complete lie because I had watched her eagerly break into my study with pure, greedy excitement just a few days ago. I listened to her pathetic, desperate lies without showing a single ounce of emotion. When she finally stopped talking to catch her breath, the absolute silence of the dark valley was deafening. I leaned closely into the microphone and spoke with a voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. I told her to stop calling me dad immediately. Family is built on mutual respect, Vanessa, I said clearly through the exterior speakers. You built your entire life on pure theft and endless greed. I reminded her of the night she casually laughed while Cameron threw me out into the pouring rain. I reminded her of the moment she aggressively smashed her way into my private study to forge my signature and steal my inheritance. I told her that she did not regret her terrible crimes at all. She only regretted that her massive fraudulent scheme had completely failed and left her with absolutely nothing. She screamed at the security camera, demanding that I open the gates. She yelled that the shadow lenders were going to kill her if she stayed out in the open. She grabbed the steel bars and violently shook them, demanding that I give her a portion of the Ironclad Holdings money because she felt she was legally entitled to it. I did not argue with her completely delusional demands. I simply reached out and pressed a specific button on my digital control panel. A small automated security drawer located at the absolute base of the heavy steel gates hissed loudly as it slid open. Vanessa immediately dropped down to her knees in the wet mud and frantically reached inside the metal box. She was entirely expecting to find thick stacks of $100 bills or the keys to an expensive vehicle. She thought her pathetic begging had finally broken my resolve, but she pulled out a single thin white envelope. She ripped it open with her trembling, muddy fingers. Inside the envelope was a cheap, prepaid commercial bus ticket bound directly for the impoverished small town she had originally come from before she moved to the city to hunt for a wealthy husband. Pinned directly to the bus ticket was a small white business card bearing the phone number of a local pro bono public defender. I spoke through the intercom one final time. I told her the commercial bus terminal was exactly 3 miles down the county road. I advised her to start walking immediately before the shadow lenders managed to track her digital location to the farm. I clearly stated that if she ever tried to approach my property again, I would immediately release the high-definition video of her forging the federal property documents directly to the authorities, and she would join her husband in a federal penitentiary. I did not wait to hear her response. I simply reached out and completely deactivated the exterior intercom system. I turned off the bright floodlights, illuminating the driveway, leaving her entirely alone in the pitch-black darkness of the cold valley. I watched the infrared camera feed as she slowly stood up, clutching the cheap bus ticket in her muddy hands. She finally realized that her fake luxury life was permanently over. She turned around and began walking a long, lonely walk down the dark, muddy road, disappearing completely into the freezing night. The heavy legal dust eventually settled over the following 6 months. The federal justice system moves incredibly slowly, but it moves with absolute crushing certainty when presented with flawless evidence. Because I had handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation an ironclad digital package of undeniable proof, the criminal trial was incredibly short. Cameron tried desperately to fight the massive fraud and embezzlement charges, but his expensive defense attorneys quickly abandoned him when his corporate funds completely dried up. He sat in the courtroom looking incredibly small and entirely defeated. A federal judge eventually sentenced him to 10 full years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The judge explicitly cited his horrific treatment of his own elderly father during the final sentencing hearing. He lost his fake tech empire, his expensive cars, and his complete physical freedom. The highly dangerous offshore loan sharks eventually realized the federal government had permanently seized their stolen money, and they vanished back into the dark international shadows, realizing the money was forever out of their reach. Vanessa never showed her face in California again, entirely disappearing into the forgotten corners of the country. As for the massive luxury penthouse in San Francisco, the resolution was perfectly clean and highly profitable. Ironclad Holdings officially executed the massive foreclosure on the $9 million property. Sullivan handled the commercial real estate listing with his usual ruthless efficiency. He completely bypassed the standard market and sold the penthouse to a wealthy foreign investor in less than 2 weeks. The massive influx of capital from the penthouse sale was completely diverted directly into the operational budget of the Sonoma farm. I sat in my warm office inside the humming data center and reviewed the new agricultural software project ledgers. The massive fortune Beatrice had built was finally being used to cultivate real sustainable growth in the world, exactly as she had always intended. The incredibly dark chapter of my life was officially closed, and a bright new foundation was finally ready to be built. The heavy steel gates closed completely behind the disappearing figure of the woman who had tried to destroy my life. I stood alone in the cool, dark night for a long time, listening to the wind sweep across the open valley. The air felt incredibly clean and entirely pure for the very first time in months. I turned around and walked slowly back up the long gravel driveway toward the massive wooden facade of the barn. I stepped through the heavy pneumatic doors, and the familiar crisp, filtered air of the climate-controlled server room washed entirely over me. The thousands of tiny green and blue lights blinked in perfect rhythmic harmony across the endless rows of black monoliths. The low mechanical hum of the industrial cooling fans sounded completely different to me now. It did not sound like a cold machine. It sounded like the steady, strong heartbeat of a completely new life. 2 full years have passed since that incredibly dark, chaotic night at the farm gates. The massive property in the Sonoma Valley looks entirely different today. The fake, rotting wooden exterior of the barn was completely removed shortly after the federal trials concluded. There is absolutely no need to hide the massive digital infrastructure anymore. The data center is now a fully recognized and highly secured corporate facility, protected by a dedicated professional security team and state-of-the-art perimeter defenses. But the massive servers inside are no longer strictly dedicated to hiding private wealth or quietly running anonymous corporate ledgers. I completely restructured the entire digital architecture to serve a much higher and far more noble purpose. When I completely took over my son's failing tech startup, I immediately pivoted the entire software engineering department toward agricultural development. Today, the massive profits generated by the commercial data routing are funneled directly into a massive philanthropic foundation created entirely in the name of my late wife, Beatrice. We provide massive financial grants to struggling local farmers all across the state. I personally review the applications sitting right here at my aluminum desk. When I read about a hard-working family farm facing imminent foreclosure from predatory banks, I use the immense financial power of Ironclad Holdings to step in and pay off their debts entirely in cash. We purchase new heavy machinery for independent growers who cannot afford commercial loans. We provide them with free access to our advanced predictive software models, helping them perfectly optimize their crop yields and survive the harsh economic climate. Cameron and Vanessa spent their entire fake existence desperately trying to extract wealth from other people to fuel their own selfish vanity. They bought expensive imported champagne and leased luxury sports cars to impress people they secretly despised. They viewed the world as a place to be violently conquered and relentlessly exploited. But Beatrice always understood that true wealth is not measured by the size of a luxury penthouse or the price tag on a designer dress. True wealth is the absolute ability to cultivate the ground you stand on and make sure it produces life for the people who actually need it. She built an invisible empire out of fiber optic cables and server racks so that one day we could use it to protect the very soil of this valley. I am incredibly proud to say that her beautiful vision has been completely realized, and her legacy is actively saving lives every single day. I walked slowly down the long, bright central aisle of the data center and sat down in my comfortable ergonomic chair. The wide, curved monitor hummed quietly on the brushed aluminum desk. I did not open any complex financial ledgers or secure global tracking networks this morning. I simply reached out and gently picked up a small, silver-framed photograph sitting right next to the keyboard. It was a beautiful picture of Beatrice taken during a summer vacation many years ago. She was smiling warmly at the camera, with her silver hair blowing gently in the ocean breeze. I looked deeply into her eyes, and I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute gratitude. I thought about the terrifying journey of the past 2 years. I thought about the night I was brutally thrown out into the freezing storm with nothing but 2 black plastic garbage bags. I thought about the devastating moment I watched my own son point a loaded, heavy-caliber weapon directly at my chest, demanding that I fix the massive banking error he created. And then I thought about the ultimate resolution of the massive conflict. The most incredible part of the entire ordeal was the simple fact that I never had to resort to their level of chaotic violence. I never had to raise my voice in pure screaming anger. I never had to throw a single punch or physically harm anyone to secure my own survival and protect my home. The silent adjustment was completely absolute. People who are consumed by pure endless greed often confuse absolute silence with complete weakness. They think that because an older man does not yell or fight back, he is simply a useless target waiting to be easily victimized. But as a retired structural engineer, I know the ultimate undeniable truth about power. The strongest foundation in the world never makes a single sound. It simply rests deep in the dark earth, bearing the immense, massive weight of the entire structure above it. It tolerates the heavy burden completely in silence until the exact moment the structural integrity of the building is completely compromised by rot and corruption. And when that fatal moment finally arrives, the foundation does not have to violently attack the building to bring it down. The foundation simply stops supporting the lies. It lets the inescapable laws of physics and gravity do the heavy, devastating work. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed the massive, corrupt weight of their own terrible decisions to pull them down into the dirt. Cameron forged the documents and stole the money completely on his own. Vanessa broke the locks and fueled his desperate greed entirely on her own. The offshore shadow lenders and the Federal Bureau of Investigation simply acted as the natural forces of gravity rushing in to fill the massive void their endless lies had created. The ultimate destruction of their fake luxury empire was an absolute mathematical certainty from the very beginning. I carefully placed the silver-framed photograph back onto the cool metal surface of the desk. I stood up from the chair and walked toward the heavy secondary security doors leading directly outside. I pressed my hand against the biometric scanner, and the thick pneumatic locks hissed open smoothly. I stepped out onto the wide wooden porch I had recently built onto the front of the administrative office. I held a warm ceramic mug of fresh dark coffee securely in my right hand. The cool morning air was incredibly crisp and entirely refreshing. The massive storm clouds that used to constantly hover over my life had completely vanished. I stood quietly on the porch and watched the early morning sun begin to slowly crest over the distant rolling green hills of the Sonoma Valley. The bright golden light spilled beautifully across my 50 acres of prime agricultural land, illuminating the deep, rich soil and the newly planted fields. The loud, chaotic noise of the San Francisco city traffic, the fake corporate parties and the desperate screaming at the heavy steel gates were entirely gone forever. There was absolutely nothing left but the gentle sound of the morning wind rushing through the tall oak trees and the quiet, distant hum of the powerful servers working tirelessly behind me. I took a slow, deep sip of the hot, dark coffee, feeling the comforting warmth spread entirely through my chest. I looked out over this beautiful green empire that Beatrice and I had built together, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt a sense of absolute, perfect, and unshakable peace. And what is the ultimate lesson to be learned from all of this? I learned that true family is not simply defined by shared blood or a common last name. It is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and unwavering decency. When you treat people as disposable assets, you eventually bankrupt your own soul. The most dangerous mistake anyone can make is confusing a person's quiet patience with absolute weakness, because sometimes the silent adjustment is the most devastating. Ultimately, true wealth is never about the luxury you hoard, but the genuine good you can cultivate for others. If you believe that arrogance always meets its inevitable downfall, and that true justice is worth waiting for, please hit the like button and subscribe for more life stories, and let me know in the comments which part of my story satisfied you the most.